One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick sat on the floor of a vacant studio apartment in the rundown apartment building where he lived and worked in northern England. The apartment building was called The Cliff, and it was across the street from the ocean in the coastal town of Seaton Carew. Carl was in the middle of painting the apartment and getting it ready for a new tenant, but he had stopped to eat some lunch and to read a few chapters of one of his favorite spy novels. Carl loved spy novels, and he had a few that he just read over and over again. But as he turned the page, something out the window caught his eye. It was his landlady, Anne Darwin, who lived in a big Victorian house right next door. And at this moment, she was standing in front of her house with her two adult sons, Anthony and Mark, and they were all dressed in black and each were holding a wreath made of flowers. And now, Carl felt a little bit like a spy himself, as he secretly watched the family of three walk across the street together to this grassy knoll that looked out over the water. Anne and her sons bowed their heads, and Carl could tell they were very likely praying, and then all three of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean. Carl knew that Anne and her sons were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin, who had actually died in a kayaking accident 2 years ago, basically in the water right out in front of their house. Carl could also see that Anne was visibly shaking, so he knew she must be crying. And when he saw that, Carl himself started to feel sad, because Carl cared deeply for Anne. He was not just her handyman and tenant. They had been secretly romantically involved ever since he had moved into the Cliff almost 2 years ago. But Carl had actually known Anne for most of his life and had been in love with her for decades. So Carl and Anne were both from a town that was near Seaton Carew, and Carl had first seen Anne on the school bus in high school, but he hadn't worked up the courage to say hello. Then soon after that, he left to go to college, but he had never stopped thinking about her. After college, Carl had started a family of his own and became a school teacher. But he lost everything after making some really bad real estate investments a few years ago. And his financial troubles had led to legal trouble, and finally he'd left his family and gone on the run from the police, living in the woods outside of Seaton Carew. That's when he and Anne had found their way back to each other. One night, in a parking lot near his campsite, Carl saw Anne pull in her car, looking very upset. And this time, he did approach her. It turned out that Anne's husband had only just had his kayaking accident a few weeks earlier, and she was obviously in a very bad place emotionally because of it. She was also desperate for help around the properties that she and her husband had owned together. So that same night, she actually let Carl move into the Cliff. And once Carl moved in, he and Anne began a somewhat unconventional romance. Carl would spend his days working to fix up the apartments inside the Cliff, and then he would spend his nights with Anne in her house. It was weird for both of them to keep their relationship secret, but they both had their reasons. For Carl, he was just afraid of being arrested if anybody knew where he was. He was on the run. And for Anne, she felt like her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow basically forever. So she didn't want to look like she basically immediately moved on from her dead husband. Now, at some point, the two of them hoped that Anne could sell her properties and that they could move far away together and start over. But they both knew that was easier said than done, because Carl would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without getting arrested. Now, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street, and he went back to reading his spy novel. And as he read the story, he made mental notes about the plot line and the main character, because Carl was actually working on a plan that maybe would allow him and Anne to start their new life together. He was actually using all of these spy novels basically as inspiration for this plan. He actually smiled to himself as he thought about how brilliant he was being. And he pictured, that someday in the future, an author would likely write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 years for Carl to finally work out his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready to put it all into action. On this morning, he walked through the airport near Seaton Carew, trying to act casual as he approached the ticketing counter. He handed his passport to the gate agent and then glanced over his shoulder, looking back to where Anne was. She was standing at the back of the line. She met his eyes, but then quickly sort of looked away because they had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other. When Carl turned back around, he saw the ticketing agent was now staring intently at his passport, and he felt his heart rate begin to pick up. So this passport that Carl was using was a fake. He had created a new identity for himself using the birth and death records of a baby that had been born in the same year as him, which was an idea from the spy novel The Day of the Jackal, about an assassin who constantly changes identities. And if it worked, he and Anne would be able to travel to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was he was going to stay there permanently if he got to Panama, and he hoped that Anne would love it enough that she would eventually move there too. Carl had read a brochure on Panama that called it a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases, which already made him feel right at home. Plus, the country was really cheap compared to the UK and far away from anyone who knew them, so he thought this was like the perfect place for them to move to. But all of that depended on this fake passport being convincing enough that the ticketing agent didn't say anything. And finally, after what felt like a very long time, the agent looked up from the passport and smiled and handed it back to Carl along with his ticket. Carl had to physically stop himself from literally sighing with relief when this happened. And instead, he just, as casually as he could, thanked the agent. And as he walked off, he turned and he sort of winked at Anne, who was still in line. After decades of reading about international spies, Carl kind of felt like one himself, and he liked this feeling a lot. And soon, he would be living permanently as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep as a real estate agent drove them through the Panamanian countryside. They sped along the highway into the jungle, and as they did, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a bend in the road, and suddenly they were driving along a sandy beach, and the realtor pulled over and said to get out and take a look and see if this plot of land felt like it could be their new home. So Carl figured that once Anne sold the cliff apartment building that she owned and combined that money with the money Anne had inherited from her husband's life insurance policies, they'd have around £600,000 in savings, which was around 800,000 American dollars. Now that was more than enough money to get set up, but they were going to need some kind of income in Panama as well. And Carl wanted to buy this land in particular in the jungle and use it to open up an eco-lodge resort. Eco-lodges were becoming really popular in Central America, and tourists paid a lot of money to stay in beachside cabins for a week and go canoeing and horseback riding and jungle trekking. Carl also wanted to build a villa on the property for just him and Anne, right there on the beach. So he led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed to the tree line on the other side of the bay, and he told her to imagine a row of cabins and a dock for a bunch of canoes and a path that led to a horse stable. And then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to imagine a beautiful seaside villa where the two of them would live. Anne kicked off her sandals and walked into the water, and Carl could tell that she was picturing what their lives might look like here. To Carl, it was like years of careful planning were finally paying off. I mean, this had been like the best week of his relationship with Anne ever. They had finally been able to act like a normal couple for the first time. They had gone out in public to dinner every night together and walked down the street holding hands. Carl loved living as John Jones. He felt free. And weirdly enough, despite the fact that his identity was fake, he felt like his old self again, the way he used to feel before he got tangled up with all of his debt. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne said that she was completely taken with Panama and that, yes, she did want to move here with Carl, and that when she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and get ready for this big move. Carl beamed, and their realtor grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the moment that they had decided to change their lives forever. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, All you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. Again, that's fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. It took another full year for Anne to sell her properties in Seton Carew and to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They had all been shocked at first, but eventually they started to understand that she really needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life. Shortly afterwards, Carl bought a condominium in Panama City so that he and Anne would have a place to live while they built their resort. And then finally, on October 22nd, 2007, Anne moved to Panama permanently. However, when Carl picked her up at the airport that night and drove her to their new home, he had to fake a smile because he had recently discovered some news that was going to throw their new life into jeopardy. And so he gave Anne a quick tour of the penthouse apartment, and then he asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table. And immediately, Anne sensed something was off and looked very worried. Carl took a deep breath, and then he told Anne that he was really excited to build their resort together. But there was one last unexpected obstacle standing in the way of their dreams. He said he had only learned about this obstacle a few weeks ago, and he had been waiting for the right moment for them to talk about it. He had just found out that the Panamanian government had instituted new procedures for anyone moving to Panama from another country. And now, English citizens needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police to prove they had no criminal record. Now, this was no problem for Anne, but it was a huge problem for Carl, because he was living in Panama as John Jones. So if the police looked into his identity, they would quickly learn that John Jones was a fake identity. Anne put her head in her hands and just said, "What are we going to do?" And Carl said he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised he would figure something out. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne as they window shopped on a busy street in Panama City. And Carl thought about ways that he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in this country illegally, because he was done hiding. I mean, the whole point of coming here to Panama was so that he and Anne could live together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop so that she could look at furniture. And as he wandered around the shop, he came across a bookshelf full of old books, including a few spy novels. Now, all the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't understand any of them, but he still picked one up and began flipping through it, hoping that maybe it would inspire him. And as he did this, he did feel inspired, but it was not by this book. He remembered the plotline of a different spy novel that he had read over a decade earlier. Even when he had been reading the novel at the time, he had thought that that plotline was too crazy to work in real life. But as they walked around that afternoon, Carl kept coming back to that idea, that plotline, and started to see how he might be able to make that work. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was risky, but he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, December 2nd, 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom, wandering around the West End of London. He did his best to look very confused as he walked through Christmas displays and waited until a store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. And Carl gave her a sort of shy smile and then asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" And when she said it was December, it's Christmas, that's why, he pretended to be confused about what day it was and where he was. And then he asked the clerk for some help. And just like he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern and then escorted him into the nearest police station. And she told the officer at the front desk that something was really wrong with this guy. The officer smiled at Carl and asked what the problem was. And now Carl knew that for his plan to work, he was going to have to give an award-winning acting performance here. And so he kind of scratched at his head and then told the officer that he had lost his whole family. The officer sat up and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Because Carl had realized that the only way to truly feel like his old self in Panama was to actually become his old self and reclaim the old identity that he had left behind. But to reclaim this identity without also reclaiming all his old debt and legal problems was going to require one more huge lie. So Carl explained to the police officer that he knew his name, but nothing else about himself, because he said he had amnesia. The officer just stared at Carl, obviously dumbfounded. Then he turned and called for his supervisor. From this moment onward, things moved fast, but not in the direction that Carl or anyone else had expected. Carl had believed that if he just claimed he had amnesia, it'd be like wiping the slate clean in England. He could just resume his old name and his old life and make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial situation with the Eco Lodge. And he'd be able to get a real passport with his real name and live happily and truly openly in Panama. But this was not what happened, because almost immediately, newspapers caught wind of Carl's story, and it made the front page. Because to the rest of the world, Carl had this incredible story. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, never knowing his true identity. And so almost overnight, Carl became big-time international news. The entire world wanted to know, where had he been the past few years? Now, Carl had not expected any of this publicity, so he and Anne were both horrified when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph from an obscure real estate website. And in this picture, Carl can be seen standing with Anne and their realtor and beaming with happiness after a day of viewing properties in Panama. And this photograph was very, very bad for Carl because it proved that he had not been wandering around homeless with amnesia in the UK like he had said to police. But this photo was really bad, really the worst, for Anne, because it proved something more shocking and more terrible than regular old financial fraud. This photo revealed a story so outlandish that it sounds like it must have come directly out of a fictional spy novel. Because it would turn out Anne was not the grieving widow she pretended to be, and her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick. Carl's real name, the one he had given that police officer in the UK when he pretended to have amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's dead husband. He and Anne had faked his death in that kayaking accident to escape his debt, and so that he and Anne could claim life insurance money. Not even their own kids knew that their father was still alive. Only Anne and obviously John did. John and Anne were both soon arrested for fraud and wound up serving more than 3 years in prison. John's very unhappy ending does in some ways mirror the ending of the very book, The Day of the Jackal, which he used for inspiration. In that book, the assassin does lots of impressive things to change his identity, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on October 9th, 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Belogasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station on a remote island in Antarctica. The common room was like the general hangout, multi-purpose area at the station, and Oleg was in there watching TV, while his coworker, Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for some time, because when they weren't working, there really was not much else to do besides sit around and drink. So Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months. He was part of a 14-person crew that was doing a year-round research stint, observing the island's ocean and weather patterns and collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg was primarily in charge of maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which took up most of his time. But there was still quite a bit of downtime, which Oleg spent inside, because being outside in Antarctica was generally pretty dangerous. There were hundreds of these lethal, deep ice crevasses that you could barely see, that if you fell into, you're dead, couldn't get out again, or the fall alone would kill you. Obviously freezing temperatures, there's lethal, violent blizzards. I mean, this is not a place built for people. So Oleg and his coworkers really only went outside when their work required it. Otherwise, they stayed put. But inside any of the various buildings at the station, their entertainment options were limited. I mean, there was just this 2-channel TV set, there was a small gym, there was a nearby church, and there was a library. And at this point, Oleg was pretty much sick of everything. I mean, he was even tired of the library, and he loved to read. But the library was really small, and he'd basically read pretty much all the books that were in there. His colleague, Sergey, who was sitting right next to him, he loved reading too, and books were something they both spent a lot of time talking about. So, since Oleg wasn't finding anything good to watch on TV and was feeling bored and kind of stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergey wanted to get into one of their deep literary conversations. And so Oleg turned off the TV and tossed the remote into the chair and took a swig of his drink, and then he glanced over to the corner where Sergey was reading the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read Fight Club. It was about this depressed man with insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts this secret club where people literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had an epic plot twist at the end. And so Oleg walked over and asked what Sergey thought of the book so far. But Sergey just kind of ignored him. But Oleg wasn't surprised. He knew Sergey really well, since the two of them had worked very closely together on various research projects over the years. So he knew Sergey was generally a very quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved getting into big, long, passionate discussions. Sometimes Oleg could get Sergey to open up by asking questions and telling jokes, but today did not seem to be one of those days. Now, this was definitely frustrating for Oleg, but he could tell, Sergey wanted to be left alone, so he stood up and left to go find something else to do. Oleg spent some time just kind of wandering around the station, checking research logs and sipping his drink. He thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air, but when he checked the temperature, he saw that it was below freezing, so he decided against it. And so after 3 hours of trying to kill time, Oleg finally just headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 p.m. when Oleg stepped into the dining room, feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he'd been drinking. And the first thing he saw when he got inside of there was Sergey. And Sergey was at a table, still reading Fight Club, just like he'd been doing earlier in the common room. So Oleg got some food and went over to sit with Sergey and see if now, maybe, he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, Sergey was. When Oleg sat down, Sergey put his book down and looked up, ready to talk, possibly because he'd also had a lot to drink and was feeling kind of chatty. And so the two men began discussing the book, Fight Club. And quickly, their conversation got really energetic because they were both, drunk and excited about what they were saying. And then Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic point about the book and what it all meant. To Oleg, it seemed like everything was going great. But all of a sudden, after making this point, Oleg noticed that Sergey had gone really quiet. And Oleg, who could read Sergey well by this point, knew what this meant. Sergey was done talking and wanted some space. So Oleg looked down at his watch. He actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over, and he was about to look up and tell Sergey that he was going to go leave and check one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergey was gone. And at that same exact moment, a wild scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building, the research station's manager was in his office going through some paperwork when his door suddenly flew open. And when the manager looked up, he saw that one of his employees was standing in the doorway looking completely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide and his breath was ragged, like he was in shock. And when the employee explained why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the employee not to move. He then grabbed his coat and flew out the door into the freezing cold. The manager pulled on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground to the building where the cafeteria was. And the whole way, he just felt his panic growing and growing because what that employee had just said had never, ever happened at their research station before. He wasn't even sure if it had happened in the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally got to the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside, and immediately he felt sick to his stomach. It would turn out Oleg and Sergey had been coworkers for a long, long time, and they did know each other really well. And what that meant was they knew each other so well that Oleg had sort of learned what specifically really annoyed Sergey. And Oleg used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a serious rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Even if you've never heard the rule explicitly, you know you don't do this. Every time Sergei would start a new book, Oleg would wait until he got about halfway through and then tell him the ending. This was not just a one-time thing. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei really, really mad. And that day in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about Fight Club. He told Sergei how it ended. And don't worry, if you haven't read it or you haven't seen the movie, we are not going to ruin the twist for you because it is amazing. You should check it out. But Oleg did. And Sergei was very drunk. And like Oleg, he had also been very restless and tense from having been cooped up in this isolated station for months on end. And so this time, when Oleg told him the ending, Sergei completely snapped. He grabbed the knife from the kitchen, walked behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did ya?" Once Sergei calmed down, he was so shocked by what he'd done that he immediately turned himself in to the station's manager. He was then transported back to Russia and arrested, but he was eventually acquitted since he had no previous record. Oleg's heart was damaged in the attack, but amazingly, he would survive after being transported to a hospital. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.